Okay, I'm going to be installing the final row of hardwood flooring. And in this particular room, the final row had to be cut, had to be ripped down to fit. And the final row in this case is falling underneath this baseboard heating. And the final row is not going to be able to be face nailed as you can in some cases do it. In this case, for example, this row was face nailed because the nailer couldn't get in, and the row before it was face nailed. But the final row, there will be no way to get a nail in there because it's underneath the heater. So what I'm going to end up doing is gluing it. And you might want to glue it and face nail it, but in this case I'm just going to have to glue it and then kind of lever it into position and just let the glue set, knowing that probably it's not going to get disturbed because there's no traffic down here. But before I do that, and just as a little bit of prepping, I will show, for example, what does it look like under this baseboard. Well, you'll see that there's the wallboard, end of the wallboard, and there's a gap between the end of the wallboard and the subfloor. That's normal. There's also a hole where the heating pipe comes up. That's normal. Now, I'd like to fill these because where there's that gap underneath there, that's a place for air from the outside world to actually leak through. And in some cases, when people put down a wall, they might put some insulation under the bottom plate of that wall to seal it, because the wooden subfloor and the bottom plate of the wall are in no way perfect planes, and they don't meet perfectly. There are gaps underneath them. Okay, so what I want to do is, I should have done this before installing the hardwood floor, but this was one of the first rooms I did, and I didn't really know some of these things. What I really want to do is caulk in this gap. When this drywall was being put up, the installers did put some plaster material, hot mud, in this gap between the wall and the floor. It's not the perfect material for this gap, and the reason is because it's rather brittle, so it cracks, and there is flexing of the hardwood of the subfloor in the wall. Over time, many of these pieces, for example, would break out. That's an example of one. Even if they were 100% covered, you'd see them breaking out. Here's another case over here, for example, when I was putting that, that piece must have been loose, so loose that I just took it out. I could kind of try, when a piece is loose like that, replacing it, but I'd rather replace it with something more substantial. I'd rather caulk it. There's an example where you can actually look under there and you can see the gap between the plate, the bottom plate of the wall, and the subfloor. Here's an example where I actually have already installed this piece. This piece is not glued in place, and I will be able to glue it partially by prying it, putting glue in, and then pulling it tight. I would like to actually get this piece out to apply the glue more uniformly, but it's kind of, at this point, wedged in, because this was a case where it's kind of a taper, and where it is it's extremely tight on this end. And the way this piece was put in was I put it in where the taper was wider, and then I slid it down. By the time it gets to this particular point, it is extremely tight against the wall, and this cannot be reversed. I did try, but I couldn't. Here, the taper is wider, so I'm going to be able to pry this out a little bit, just add a little bit of glue, pull it in, and then it should be fine, okay? But before I go through all of this, first step is I'm going to fill these gaps with caulk where I can. I won't be able to do that, obviously, in this case here where I can't pull it out, but that's just too bad. I would like to, but no can do. Okay, now I'm going to just be using some caulk that I really need to use up. I just happen to have it brown. caulk. It's perfectly fine for this purpose. It's older, but it works fine. I've used it in other non-critical applications. On this particular case, this caulk happened to have been something I inherited from a friend. And here's a technique that he used to seal his old caulk tubes. He used these large electrical, whatever you call them, these twisting things that you use to, nuts, they call them wire nuts. Okay, now the thing about the wire nut is it has some threads in it. And when you put it over here, it will actually thread the plastic. And it forms a really extremely tight seal, such that you don't even have to, I used to put a nail in here, but this this caulk will actually stay good when it's sealed this way. You don't have to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on pause. I'm going to start putting some of this caulk in just to show you how it goes. Okay. Okay, so here's the first gap. I have simply basically mushed that in with my fingers into that. This is the brown caulk. Looks very messy, but it looks like it's just filling underneath that gap pretty fine. I mushed it in with my fingers. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to try filling up that gap when the pipe comes through, because I don't like having that hole in the floor like that. Things can fall into it, liquids, whatever. It's just, it's probably not so critical, but I have the caulk, and I've done this before. It seems to work okay, so I'm just going to squeeze that in there and see how that turns out. Okay, I just filled that in down there. And next, I think I will fill in that spot, and I'll probably run a very thin bead along the base of that hot mud, because I know that is not actually sealed against the floor, it's just sitting there because of the way that it's, you know, rigid. It does not form a seal because it's too rigid a material for the floor and the wall because of the flexing in the floor. Okay, the caulk is, I think, a reasonable sealant there. Okay, here I filled up that other gap, and I also started applying a thin bead down at the base of the sections, even where the hot mud is in place. And you just have to work your finger in there. Try to keep it very thin on the subfloor because I don't want it to interfere with the hardwood floor. And we'll just see how that goes. I'll put in some more along the rest of this stretch. Okay, here I'm going to show you a little bit more of how the work is done. I can't really get the tip all the way in there because of having put in this hardwood floor first. So I can only get it, lay down a bead that's close, but I can't really push it into the crack. So you can see here that I'm simply laying some down. And then I'm just going to take my finger, whichever one fits the best, and then I just work it through, trying to push it into that crack at the bottom. Okay, and it seems to work okay, but it's laborious. Okay, there I have finished working that bead into that crack with my finger, and it's definitely very messy. I need a lot of paper towels. I want to keep it smooth on the bottom so I can put the hardwood floor down onto it. And it would have been much easier had I done this beforehand, but I kind of just stuck with it. I kept working the caulk in and then cleaning it off my hands. I went through a lot of paper towels. Okay, I'm going to stop this here. I'll have another video where I actually glue in the hardwood floor because this really is not that step. This is really just caulking between the wall and the subfloor. Okay, thanks.